Transport yourself back in time to the medieval era, where darkness falls early and the world around you is full of unknowns. The people of that time were plagued by fear of the forces of nature that were largely beyond their understanding. It was an age marked with uncertainty, where the inexplicable was a constant source of anxiety. In this world, beliefs in witchcraft and superstition were widespread and held great power. Join us as we explore the mysterious realm of medieval witchcraft and superstitions, uncovering how people of the Middle Ages grappled with their fears and how it shaped their daily lives in this episode of History Unveiled. The notion of witchcraft in the Middle Ages covered a very broad-ranging spectrum of practices. While we often think of witchcraft as harnessing magic to cast spells, brew potions, and perform divination, the definition in fact extends far beyond this. Of course, one of the most common practices associated with witchcraft was the use of magic. People believed that witches had the power to perform magic and summon spirits, and this belief was reinforced by the church, which taught that witchcraft was a form of heresy and that witches were in a league with the devil. Divination was also considered to be a form of witchcraft. People believed that witches had the power to foretell the future and read the stars, and that they could use this power to harm others. One of the most common methods of divination used in medieval witchcraft was the use of tarot cards, which were believed to have originated in the Middle East and then spread to Europe. Tarot cards were used to read the future and interpret the past, and were used in divination by both men and women. Another common method of divination used in medieval witchcraft was the practice of reading tea leaves. This method involved reading the patterns made by the leaves or grounds at the bottom of the cup and interpreting them as symbols or signs. Astrology, a particularly popular practice during the Middle Ages, was also considered to be a form of divination associated with witchcraft. The movement of the planets and stars was widely interpreted as having an influence on human affairs and the natural world. It was accepted as a legitimate science in the Middle Ages, and astrologers were believed to have the power to portend the future and interpret the signs of the stars. Other methods of divination used in medieval witchcraft included the reading of entrails of animals, interpreting the flight of birds, and studying the patterns of smoke from burning herbs. All of these methods were believed to have had the power to reveal hidden knowledge, and were often associated with witches, magic, and the occult. In many cases, practices that fell under the umbrella of witchcraft back in the Middle Ages would now simply be considered healthcare. The ability to heal others through apothecary and other forms of early medicine was often considered a sign of connection with witchcraft and the occult. And in fact, many of those accused of being witches were the closest thing their communities had to physicians. Belief in witchcraft was widespread in the medieval period and was considered a very real and present danger. Death was everywhere in these times. Daily life was never far from disease or war, and the Black Death plague alone is believed to have wiped out up to half of the population of Europe at the time. The sense of fear and the presence of the dark and magical is clearly seen in the artwork of the time, such as the popular motif of the Danse Macabre, a representation of man's constant dance with death. The belief in magic and general superstition towards life itself held by the people of the medieval age led the belief in witchcraft to become commonplace. Witchcraft was often thought to be a form of devil worship, and those accused of witchcraft were often seen as agents of evil. Many societies believed witches had the power to harm and curse individuals and communities, causing illness, death, and other misfortunes. The practice of witchcraft was closely associated with magic and the use of charms and spells. Across much of Europe, pagan beliefs and practices were still to be found, even in communities that had been officially converted to Christianity. If the common folk were to believe in the power of traditional medicine and folk healing, this posed a threat to the church. In order to avoid having their power undermined by these folk beliefs, the practice of witchcraft was demonized, and those accused of it faced ostracization, exile, or worse. The The witch trials that became more and more prominent during the late medieval and early modern period were closely related to sexism in the practice of medicine. During this time, most people believed that illnesses and other misfortunes were caused by supernatural forces, and that witches were responsible for many of these ills. This belief was deeply rooted in the patriarchal societies of Europe and later North America, and it was often used to explain the illnesses and misfortunes that affected mostly women. During the witch trials, women were disproportionately targeted and accused of witchcraft, as they were believed to be more susceptible to the influence of evil spirits and therefore more likely to engage in witchcraft. This belief was reinforced by the fact that women were often the primary caretakers of the sick and injured, and were often responsible for healing and care within families and communities. In addition, at least in the practice of medicine, women were not considered to be as knowledgeable as men, and their knowledge and practices were often dismissed or rejected by male authorities. And this led to the marginalization of women in the field of medicine and their exclusion from formal medical education and professional organizations. The marginalization of women and their exclusion from mainstream medicine also contributed to the growing regularity of witch hunts and witch trials across Europe, as their knowledge and practices were seen as suspicious and their healing methods were often associated with witchcraft. The witch trials were therefore a way to control, repress, and punish marginalized groups who practice medicine and healing, reinforcing the patriarchal belief that women were inferior and needed to be controlled. It's important to note that the witch trials were a complex phenomenon, shaped by a variety of social, economic, political, and religious factors. And it was not only related to gender, but also class, religious, and political motives. As the suspicion towards witches grew stronger and stronger throughout the medieval period, the occurrence of witch hunts became an increasingly common phenomenon. These hunts took place primarily in Europe, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, and to a lesser extent in North America during the late medieval and early modern period from the 15th to the 18th centuries. The peak of the hunts was in the 50-year period between 1580 and 1630. Some witch hunts swept across entire regions and could go on for years at a time. At its peak, it is estimated that there were up to 100,000 trials for witchcraft over a similar period of time. Of those convicted of witchcraft, it's estimated that at least 80% were women, and the period between the year 1560 and 1670 alone saw more than 40,000 deaths as a result of the execution of supposed witches. The trials were conducted by both religious and secular authorities. They were often based on little or no evidence and relied on methods such as torture to extract confessions. Those found guilty were often executed by burning at the stake or by hanging. During the Middle Ages, most people also believed in a host of supernatural creatures, such as ghosts, demons, and fairies, which were thought to be responsible for mysterious occurrences and unexplained events. People believed that the devil and were consulted to determine the best time to administer medicine or perform surgery. And it was also closely related to religion, and the church had a complex relationship with it. On one hand, the church accepted astrology as a legitimate science, and many church officials studied astrology and used it to predict the future. On the other hand, the church also saw astrology as a form of divination and a challenge to its authority, and many astrologers were persecuted as heretics. Overall, the belief in witchcraft, astrology, and superstition coexisted with religious belief, with many people taking comfort in the answers these beliefs provided. For the people of medieval Europe, belief in witchcraft and the occult provided a sense of